The question is, Senator Pratt. Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. As a servant to the people of Queensland and Australia, I rise with a sense of obligation to Australian workers to speak on the Fair Work Registered Organisations Amendment Bill. The government has a mandate specifically for this bill. The chamber must give careful and due consideration to this bill, as it is central to the calling of the double dissolution election, a rare occurrence in Australian political history. As I mentioned when the CFA legislation came before the Senate, Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party travelled from the north of Queensland to rural Victoria to learn how the Australian industrial relations system was affecting the economy and how it was viewed by everyday Aussies. This bill begins the process of pulling apart the elites. And by elites, I mean those union bosses who lord over hard-working mums and dads, who struggle to pay their union fees and who should rightly expect the best and most diligent representation by their union. This bill brings rule of law to the elites, the union bosses, who have failed to adhere to law or think they are above it. Australians always kick back when they think a group or person has too much power. The strong community support that exists for this bill is the result of the concentration and wielding of ugly power by elitist union bosses. Finally, Aussie workers can breathe easy that this law will have their back. And having Australia's back was an exact promise of Pauline Hanson at the last election. This bill seeks to bring the regulation of unions into line with the standards required of corporations and their directors. This long overdue legislation aims to create a Registered Organisations Commission to take over responsibility for the oversight of unions and employer organisations from the ineffectual union-dominated Fair Work Commission. A high level of accountability is a measure for which Pauline Hanson's One Nation has been calling for some time. Why is this bill central to our philosophy? Central to our assessment of legislation is the concept of ensuring freedom wins over any proposed control mechanism. The bill sets workers free to have representation without the yoke of a union boss' theft of resources, and imposes on union bosses the obligation to look after union members' fees in trust with reasonable fiduciary obligations, obligations every other section of the community is expected to meet. This bill is about protecting workers, standing up for workers and giving workers rights to ensure they are not unfairly or grossly controlled by elitist union bosses. Specifically, this bill seeks to bring the regulation of unions into line with the standards required of corporations and their directors. Provisions of the bill include, firstly, increasing the obligations of union office holders to disclose conflicts of interest and, where necessary, recuse themselves from making decisions on matters in which they have an interest. Secondly, increasing the requirements for union financial transparency and disclosure and making breaches enforceable by civil action. And most importantly, creating meaningful criminal penalties for those union bosses who breach their statutory duties in line with those that company directors currently already face. In order to have sufficient power to monitor and induce compliance with these provisions, this bill will also create the Office of the Registered Organisations Commissioner, whose powers, most appropriately, will be modelled on those in the Australian Securities and Investments Commission Act 2001, which also aligns them with those which govern corporations and their directors. Mr Acting Deputy President, this bill is largely in response to the shocking corruption scandal that engulfed the Health Services Union and the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Union Corruption conducted by Commissioner Don Dyson Hayden, QC. Honourable Senators will recall the case of disgraced former Labor MP Craig Thomson, the former National Secretary of the HSU. No doubt many of my colleagues will recount the stories of excess from that union. Even after overwhelming evidence of Thomson's criminality was revealed, former Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard said in Question Time on 16th of August 2011, quote, "I have complete confidence in the member for DeBell. I look forward to him continuing to do that job for a very long time to come." Some may wonder if he's still here. Then, of course, there was Thomson's successor at the HSU, Labor stalwart and so-called whistleblower, Kathy Koukouvis-Jackson, who was supposed to clean up the HSU after the Thomson scandal. These people are reprehensible, and indeed this bill will address their behaviour. However, I want to turn the attention of the Senate to the leader of the Labor Party, a man who would not be Labor leader if it were not for the shady dealing he has engaged in with the most ill-repute union, the CFMEU. Mr Shorten's dirty dealings to gain the CFMEU's support for his tilted Labor leader resulted in his ardent opposition to this bill, and it stinks. This is how corrupt these elites are. The CFMEU actually funds GetUp, an organisation which aims in cahoots with American billionaires to deindustrialise Australia, the very industries that their members belong to. They do these acts in name of global warming without any evidence and contrary to the empirical evidence on climate. It is a completely political agenda. GetUp agitates for a shortened prime ministership. Follow the money and you find the corruption of the elites. Today, someone else has to pay the bill, Shorten. The honourable Labor leader has consistently spoken against increasing penalties on union officials for breaches of law who breach fiduciary duties to their members. Then again, Mr Acting Deputy President, the honourable Labor leader's position is hardly surprising, given his own colourful history. As the former National Secretary of the AWU between 2001 and 2007, Victorian State Secretary from 1998 to 2007, and Victorian State President of the Labor Party from 2005 until 2008, the honourable Labor leader was a person of great interest to the Royal Commission into Union Corruption. The Royal Commission into Union Governance heard that Mr Shorten accepted and failed to disclose large donations for himself from employers while negotiating for the union on behalf of employees, secret commissions to sell his fellow union members down the river. Mr Acting Deputy President, by any measure, these behaviours do not meet fiduciary obligations to protect the people who he represents and serves. No wonder Mr Shorten opposes this legislation, when he would have gained the most from rorting innocent workers among the lowest paid in Australia. Rorting workers is the true hallmark of an elite hell-bent with personal power and glory. The honourable leader of the opposition admitted to the Commission that he had failed to declare a political donation of around $40,000 from a Labor hire company in the lead-up to the 2007 election campaign, and that invoices regarding the payments for services were not truthful. Mr Shorten, however, claimed to have no knowledge of false invoicing totalling more than $300,000, which had been sent to construction company Tees John Holland, a convenient form of selective amnesia. These donations were undeclared because they were a payoff, Mr Acting Deputy President, a payoff to agree to lowering the wages and conditions of his already poorly paid union members. No wonder he wanted to keep them secret. So let's be clear, Mr Acting Deputy President, the leader of a major union and now the self-styled leader of the so-called Workers' Party took secret commissions from employers to sell his own union members down the drain. This is the behaviour of an elite with no care for the rule of law. It is as if laws are for the peasants, accountability for the poor. The elites would call them the great unwashed, would call us the great unwashed. For now, he says, we don't need a registered organisations commission, Mr Acting Deputy President. I ask you. During cross-examination, counsel assisting the Commissioner, Mr Hayden, QC, said that honourable leader of the opposition was being evasive and non-responsive, their words. Evasive and unresponsive, Mr Acting Deputy President? Well, it's hardly surprising, is it? I mean, if he was honest, he'd have to admit he betrayed his fellow union members, just like Craig Thompson, Michael Williamson and Kathy Jackson. Mr Hayden, QC, said, and I quote, "What I'm concerned about is your credibility as a witness and perhaps your self-interest as a witness as well." The Commissioner didn't believe him, Mr Acting Deputy President, didn't believe him because he knew a lie when he heard one. On Mr Shorten's watch as AWU Secretary, massive conflicts of interest and ripping off his own AWU members in crooked side deals with employers like Clean Event was the order of the day.
Senator Roberts, you really have been taking us right to the limit with what's allowed in this debate, and I think you are now crossing the line. I draw your attention to Standing Order 193, Part 3, where you can't make all imputations of improper motives and all personal reflections on members of this House or the other House are not allowed. So I would ask you just to give consideration to that in continuing with your remarks.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. But it is no wonder, in my view, the Labor leader is desperate to prevent its passage. Stopping this bill is what an elite would do. So let's recall what Mr Shorten's cronies had to say about this legislation. Labor Workplace Relations spokesman Brendan O'Connor fulminated with confected indignation when this bill came before the House of Representatives. The member for Gorton said, and I quote, "The opposition will not support a politically motivated witch hunt designed to kill off unions." Kill off unions? This is designed to strengthen unions and strengthen union members. So, Mr Acting Deputy President, the member for Gorton appears to think that financial transparency and accountability is a witch hunt to control of unions. Well, that's hardly surprising, is it? Since his own brother, Michael O'Connor, is the CFMEU's National Secretary, that has been charged with industrial offences. Something of a conflict of interest, I would think, Mr Acting Deputy President. In fact, protecting criminal activities by unions seems to be perhaps something that runs in the CFMEU's DNA. A family connection to the highest levels of the most corrupt and lawless union in the country hardly qualifies the member for Gorton to pronounce judgment on this bill. In fact, I think the vehement opposition of the likes of the CFMEU National Secretary and his brother is the strongest recommendation for the Registered Organisations Bill yet. What else has been said by the cabal of Labor elites? When this bill was last in the Senate, my honourable colleague Senator Cameron claimed this bill was, quote, all about the coalition's obsession with destroying collective bargaining in this country. The bill, said Senator Cameron, is about the government introducing over-the-top regulation and red tape of the union movement. Well, how wrong can anyone be? In truth, this bill is only about destroying corrupt practices such as the stealing of union members' money by criminal and union bosses, taking food from the tables of innocent workers and engorging the paycheck and waistline of union bosses is abhorrent and unacceptable. So does the senator still believe that these practices are so central to union operations that banning them will destroy the union movement? Apparently so. Now some former Labor figures have recognised the necessity of this bill. As Senator Cash mentioned in question time 2 weeks ago, Paul Howes, Bill Shorten's successor at the AWU, said 3 years ago, "I can't see any reason why anyone in the union movement would fear having the same penalties that apply to company directors." Former ACTU President Martin Ferguson stated, "There is an absolute obligation on the union movement to clean up its house," and former Labor Attorney General Robert McClelland, who said there was unquestionably a case for further legislative reform. ACTU Secretary Bill Kelty has also been previously quoted as saying, "I was always on that side of the debate which said that unions are public bodies, so they are accountable to members for their management. They are accountable to members for their management." These are reasonable and rational comments by honest advocates of the union movement. They highlight the case for a legal fiduciary obligation on union bosses to be implemented. All of these comments have come from the union movement itself. No one should ever expect to waltz through life unaccountable for spending other people's money. There is a legal expectation in every industry that other people's money, given in trust, must be spent to benefit of those people for whom one holds the money. A fiduciary obligation for union bosses to take care of their workers should be a natural occurrence, but sadly, some union bosses have become negligent and lawless in their behaviours. When a union boss is corrupt, their malfeasance results in a number of repercussions that ricochet throughout the entire economy. The first of these is the increased cost to consumers. Everyday Aussies pay more for products like construction, delivery of goods, manufactured items or delivery of public services, just for some examples. Further, the economy grinds to a halt as union bosses extort and seek to control workplaces free from punishment of law. At will they do it. Other effects of lawless union bosses seeking to control our economy include lower productivity, resistance to investment, lower employment and damaged export capacity. So one would think, of course, that the Labor Party today would be keen to support measures to identify and prosecute such flagrant and criminal breaches of the trust of rank-and-file union members, promote and support the economy and increase industry. But no, in Bill Shorten's Labor, theft and malfeasance is encouraged and flourishes unpunished with complete abandon. All that today's Labor members and senators seem interested in doing is protecting the snouts in the trough of their union boss cronies. And there was me, thinking that unions were there to represent the interests of their members in an honest and transparent, accountable manner. Bill Shorten promised to run Australia like he would run a union. And frankly, that would surely mean theft of taxpayers' money, taking bribes to sell out our great nation, standover tactics, extortion reigning, extreme levels of control, and abuse if you don't do things Uncle Bill's way.
Senator Roberts, no. You must refer to members by their proper title, and again, I think you are really pushing against the limits of what's allowed by the standing orders.
The United States, the Hillary Clinton School of Governance, which would seem to be appropriate. I say to the Senate, Mr. President, the world dodged the Clinton bullet and holds our hope by passing this legislation we can dodge the union bullet as well, the union boss's bullet. Then, of course, we also have seen the Greens stand up on their hind legs to denounce this bill. During previous and today's debate in this chamber, Watermelon Green Senator Lee Rhiannon has repeatedly attacked it.
Senator Roberts, you do not refer to other senators like that. And
I retract that comment, Mr. Deputy President.
Yes, and I would ask you to be mindful of the standing orders.
Attacking the union movement to drive... This is what Senator Rhiannon said. This is ugly legislation. Attacking the union movement to drive down wages and conditions, as set out in this bill, is integral to how the Liberals and Nationals operate. Returning a union movement, a corrupt union movement, to rule of law is apparently against Senator Rhiannon's commitments. I say to Senator Rhiannon, if one fails to support this bill, then what one is in fact wanting is a bunch of union bosses free to spend union members' money on prostitutes, Labor Party campaigning, jewellery and home renovations. But then I also remember that the CFMEU donates heftily to the Greens Party. If they are free to wantonly spend this money, then they are free to jack union fees up higher and cause more financial pain to working families. In fact, Mr. Acting Deputy President, no one who isn't wearing a shabby koala suit and clutching a dog-eared copy of Das Kapital could possibly fail to see that this legislation is simply about honesty and decency. Holding union bosses to a fiduciary standard, which, if they were honest representatives of their members, they would already be upholding in a very basic and long overdue requirement. It is certainly nothing to do with driving down wages and conditions, as the extremist left rather hysterically screams. Far from being an attack on unions, this legislation is about defending honest, hard-working union members from immoral and criminal union bosses who abuse their positions of trust and responsibility to steal from their own members. That's what this legislation is really about. Yet for all their sanctimonious cant, the arguments ranged by the opposition, by the opponents of this bill, are simply a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, yet signifying nothing. Far from attacking unions, this legislation actually protects ordinary, everyday, rank-and-file unionists by ensuring that their leaders act in their interests rather than simply the leaders' bosses' interests. This legislation protects ordinary union members, everyday Aussies, from having their funds stolen by corrupt union bosses, so it is astonishing that the Labor Party would be so vehemently opposed to it. In truth, as Paul Howes, Martin Ferguson, Robert McClelland and Bill Kelty have recognised, if the Labor Party actually represented everyday working people, this would be their legislation, not the government's. And let me take up something that Senator Dastyari mentioned about volunteers. This will encourage volunteers to join boards because volunteers will now be able to hold people accountable, and if they don't like the corrupt dealings of a board, they can either change it or get off. But of course, the tragic reality is that the party of the working man and woman, the party of Chifley and Curtin, has ceased to exist. This legislation has simply exposed the modern Shorten-led Labor Party for what it is, a party whose original ideology of promoting the interests of workers has been perverted and subverted to simply doing whatever works to promote the interests, of Labor and union bosses. What Bill Shorten What Mr Shorten's, Labor's hysterical opposition to this legislation only goes to illustrate is how utterly debased, cynical and hypocritical the opposition to this legislation has become on this watch. Mr Acting Deputy President, the most profound truth that opposition to the Fair Work Registered Organisations Amendment Bill has revealed is that while Labor began as a movement, it now ends as a gang, a movement to control people. Instead, on this side, in Pauline Hanson's One Nation, we support freedom and rule of law, two fundamental tenets for human progress. Thank you, Mr Deputy President.